Hey, it's Patrick from Frontly. I'm going to show you how to use our row and column blocks in order to make your own custom layouts that can be nested with as many rows and columns as you want, and I'll talk about some of the other styles that are related to that and how to build a nice user interface essentially. So I have a completely blank page, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a row. So a row is a horizontal side-by-side grouping of items, in this case blocks. So if I add a table, it's going to fill the whole width because that's all there is in the row. But if I add a form as well, now they're taking up equal amounts of space. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly set up these blocks, select their spreadsheets, and I'll put this form into create mode. So now I've got a row, I've got a table on the left, form on the right. They're taking up equal amounts of space, which might be fine, but that's not really what I want. What I want is for the form to be smaller, and I want the table to stretch to fill the remaining space depending on the screen size. So you can see that when I have my form selected, there's this setting called fill remaining space. I think you'll find this in every block almost inside a row. So when I turn this off, it tells the form, don't stretch to fill the space in the row, just stay at your width setting. And in this case, I can adjust the width as well. So I'm going to set that to 250 pixels. So now what I have is I have a row with a 250 pixel width form on one side, and then I have a table. And if I minimize this block styles bar for a second, you can see that the table is just going to keep stretching to fill all the remaining space except for that 250 pixels that the form is taking up. So this is kind of nice. You can add a section that essentially acts as sort of like a sidebar. You can put content in there. A form is cool because it becomes like a sidebar sort of editor depending on what you're doing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to my row, and I'm going to make one more important adjustment. I want this to start this way, but I also want it to look good on mobile. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the allow row wrapping setting. It won't immediately visually make an obvious difference, but what it's doing is it's telling this row, hey, if you run out of space and the row width gets smaller than the minimum width setting for both or all of the blocks that are in this row, then it's going to let the block start moving down to the next row. So I'll show you exactly what I mean here. So when you set this this row wrapping setting, you're going to want to just think a little bit about the width that you've set for your blocks. So because I have the fill remaining space on this table, even though it has a 300 pixel width, it's still stretching to fill the space. But this 300 now is acting as essentially a minimum width for this row wrapping feature. I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to open this little window that's going to allow me to sort of resize my screen. Now, if I move the screen, you can see that as soon as that table gets to the point where it's just starting to go, it would go under 300 pixels in width. The row doesn't allow that. The row says, okay, great. I guess, there's not enough space anymore. So we're going to put that form down below it. This is awesome for mobile responsiveness. And if I did actually want to have the form be full width no matter what, then I could keep the fill remaining space on, and then it would still have that width. The only difference is that in my desktop layout, it's still going to take up that space. Now there are a few other settings you can mess around with. You can mess around with a combination of the width setting compared to the other width setting. So I set this to 200 and then I set this to 500. So it does kind of accomplish what I want. It still keeps the form pretty small, but then if I go back to my sort of pretend mobile view here, you can see that they're always taking up the full width when they're on separate rows, which is kind of nice. So these are things to play around with. Now, here's another cool setting that you may not have paid much attention to if you've messed around with rows, is the horizontal alignment and the vertical alignment. In this case, because I have the width stretching, I'll actually have to turn this off, and I'll have to set it a bit smaller in order to properly showcase this. So you can see that I have set static widths 300 and 200, and so they're not filling the whole space anymore. And so now my horizontal alignment settings will actually do something. They'll they'll tell it to either be totally spaced apart or spaced with the space in between them or in the middle or whatever. So that's pretty useful, especially because you can put rows inside columns and columns inside rows. So you can build these very sophisticated combinations of layouts, and alignment is really important. So the other one that's important is the vertical alignment. Because these are two different heights, just purely based on the fact that the form has taller content than the table does right now. If I set this horizontal centering, you can see that the table is floating there. Now I can set it to the bottom, or what I think is really nice when you're using a row is this one, which is called stretch. So you can see the table now has just stretched to fill the available space, which is just meeting the same height as the other highest, like the tallest block in the row. I just think this tends to look better because it means that you don't have weird sort of misalignment between the bottom of these cards, which can look kind of odd. Another thing to pay attention to is that you can adjust on the page level. You can adjust the background color, which is kind of nice. So maybe I want to set some kind of sort of like a nice light kind of tan gray sort of color. I don't know. I mean, something like that. And now you can set the background color for your cards as well. I'll get my styles tab open here. So for every card that has the show background on, if you turn this off, the background just disappears, and some of the styling spacing options with it. But I can adjust the colors of the card as well. So I don't think I'm going to make it anything else right now, but anyway, that's just something to keep in mind. So I would say for the most part, you probably want to set a reasonable size for your items, and for something like a table, you probably want the fill remaining space on. You want it to be able to show all the data that it can, and that's great. Now, if you want to start getting into more complex layouts, you don't have to just use a row. You can use a column, or you can use rows and columns inside of each other. So I'm going to delete my table, and instead I'm going to add a column. So you can see here, we've tried to visualize it, that this is items side by side and this is items stacked on top of each other. So I'm going to add my column, and I'll add a background to my column. So now it's like this visual thing, but I can still put stuff inside of it. I can actually do whatever I want inside this column. I'm going to add some text and some buttons. So I've got them over here, and we have this block of visualizer here, so I can drag and reorder things just like this. Makes it easy if I want to move things around. And if I go to my page level, I actually have, on the basics tab, I have this sort of full page visualization of the hierarchy of the blocks. And so this is really important because everything is inside that one row. And inside that row, there's the products form, but then there's my column. And so I have all of these blocks inside that column, and I can see that, which is really nice. I'm going to save my page so I don't mess things up too much. But if I want, I can click and drag my button right to the root of the page by dragging it above that, or I can drag it right back in, and just as long as I drag it underneath this column, it's going to jump right in there. So that's pretty nice for being able to move things around, or I can jump it right into the row. So you can't do it visually in this part, but you can do it right here, and that's kind of nice because you can see the proper, you can actually visualize the hierarchy here. So first thing I notice is that there's no padding for my column. By default, there's no padding just because we don't really know what you're doing with it. So I'm going to add 30, give it some nice spacing there. I'll just delete this random button over here. And now let's get a bit more technical. So I've got a column, but now I'm going to add another row inside my column. And there are two ways to move items around, as I showed you. You can drag items. So now if I go like this, let's say I want to move one of my buttons into that row. All I have to do is drag it beneath that row, and it goes into the row. So because there's not a totally clear visualization here, one thing that we've added, which makes life a little bit easier, let me see if I can find this. We have this setting called Show Layout Grid Lines. Now, if you turn that on, it just gives this sort of dashed border around rows and columns. It gets pretty confusing when you're building if you don't really have the ability to see. Like, I may not want to add a visual background like, this to every row. And so if that's the case, then it just makes editing a little bit harder. Now, let's say I want to take this text, I'll make it nice and big, and then I'll go to my row and I'll add some alignment here. Maybe I actually do want a background, and I'll add some color so we can just get a sense of what's going on here. I'll add some padding as well. So you can see how there's technically no limit to how many rows and columns can be inside of each other. And with the combination of a simple row and column structure, you can build almost anything. Now, just to articulate my point a bit more, I'm going to add one more row. In fact, something that we just recently released is if I hit the Command C or Control C, depending on your operating system, and then Command V, I can duplicate a block. And so now I have this row, and what I'm going to do is I'll go back to my page hierarchy. I'm going to drag that row into my column. So now I've just got this. I'm just going to get rid of these just by pressing the delete key. I can trigger this deletion action. So just to recap, I've got a row, I've got products form in it, and then I've got a column. Inside that column, I have two rows, and in each one, there's a text and a button. So you can see how you can really make some pretty advanced stuff here. And maybe if for some reason I wanted to space these out differently, I should be able to do that. So because my column is, because these have a specific, because these are full width, I guess I won't be able to do that, but I should be able to set a width if I want. So I can turn off the fill remaining space, set the width to 300. So yeah, you can start to see how you can play around with these different things and see how the spacing options work for you.